We'll go ahead and get started because we have a lot of great content today. So I'm Cynthia Bennett, a postdoc in Carnegie Mellon's Human-Computer Interaction Institute. And this is Accessibility Seminar, where we invite community members and researchers to talk about accessibility and disability. And so we'll begin with a couple of access notes. So please keep your mic muted unless you are going to speak. And before speaking, please say your name. And we are starting to use a captioning service called otter.ai. So if you'd like to follow along with a real-time automatic transcript of the seminar, you can do so by activating the live on otter.ai notes indicator in the top left of your screen. Activate the drop-down arrow and choose the option to view stream on otter.ai live notes. And that should open up a URL where you'll watch the captions appear. So please write something in the chat or interrupt the facilitators if you're having trouble accessing the seminar today. We want to make sure we fix those problems if they arise. So today we are talking about Universal Design for Learning, what we will call UDL from now on. And as we all know, COVID has changed the way that we do instruction altogether. But even before that, we know that about 20% of people have disabilities. And studies have shown that up to 70% of students who can benefit from accommodations actually don't request them. So maybe some students don't know that they're eligible, or others find the process to be really difficult. And so UDL is a different philosophy that instead of having to request accommodations, that courses should be accessible and flexible from the beginning. So students have a lower barrier to participate. So we're joined today by 3 experts in UDL, which they will define and kind of give examples of in more detail. But first, I'll introduce them. So going in alphabetical order, I'll say a panelist's name, and then the panelists can say hello, so their video becomes prominent, and then I'll read a brief bio. So Brianna, can you say hi?
Hi there.
Well, Brianna Blaser is a counselor and coordinator at the Disability Opportunities Internet Working and Technology Center located at the University of Washington. She's a project manager for several National Science Foundation projects, including Access Computing and Access CS for All. And most of this work focuses on increasing access to computer science education and careers. And we're excited to welcome Brianna back today because she actually got her bachelor's in psychology and math from CMU. Next, we have Meg. Can you say hi?
Hi, everyone.
Hi. So Meg Ray is a freelance consultant, education researcher, and adjunct professor. She teaches online special education courses at Hunter College, in which she actually models the UDL approaches. She researches and trains. And Meg's research concerns teacher development on how to insert UDL into computer science education. And finally, we have Sara. Sara, can you say hi?
Yep, I'm just finding the unmute button. I'm Sara Schley. Hi.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Sara Schley is the professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology and the director at the Research Center for Teaching and Learning at the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. And she's an award-winning post-secondary educator who researches and trains faculty on how to implement UDL and deaf education into their pedagogy. And she also centers deaf and disabled student perspectives when evaluating curricula and works to raise participation of deaf and disabled scholars in the academy. So now we'll move on to our questions. And so I'll kind of ask a big question and the panelists will get an opportunity to answer. And then at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. So as an introduction, I'm curious if y'all can each name kind of one experience you had briefly that motivated you to start implementing UDL in your own practice. And we'll go in alphabetical order just to make things easier. So beginning with Brianna.
Excellent. Well, when I started working at Do It, I actually did not have a background in disability. So my graduate work was in women's studies and thinking about women in science and engineering, and the reason that there's so much underrepresentation there. So I had very little background in disability when I came to Do It, but I was willing to learn. And one of the first things I did was help to edit a special issue of the Journal on Post-Secondary Education and Disability. And one of the articles in there was specifically about captioning. And I'm sure Sara has a lot to say about captioning as well. But it talked about the benefits of captioning not only being for students who are deaf or hard of hearing and are using those, but the extent to which folks like non-native speakers of English relied on captioning to learn and how it helps with jargon. And it's just such a clear example, you know, and the more I thought about it, it was like, gosh, I actually watch the captions on my TV at home all the time because I miss something, or I want the volume turned down low when my kids are sleeping, or, you know, whatever. So that was kind of my first eye-opening moment of like, oh, there's a reason we can do this that actually helps everybody.
Thanks. Meg, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, for me, it was from my own personal experience as a graduate student. I have several disabilities, including ADHD, OCD, and chronic illness. For me, in the handful of courses that used UDL as a graduate student, it was very useful for me. And I could have really benefited from more of that. So just from that experience, I recognized that a lot of my graduate students, even high performing students, may have disabilities I'm unaware of. So that's why I was interested in doing that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that experience. And Sara, I'm curious, can you round our introductions out?
Absolutely. It's, you know, at this point in my career, it's interesting because I also have sort of a long view back, and I suspect that what motivated much of my work are some growing up experiences that I had where my family moved to 2 different countries and put me into native schools. So I have always come at this from a language perspective and increasing ways for people to interact when they have different communication preferences, skills, variability, whatever. I also, for 20 years now, have been the parent of a child with a mobility disability. They have CP and they use a wheelchair. So that also has my window into it has always been in terms of interaction, you know, how social interaction can happen when there's a combination of wheelchairs and not wheelchairs. So really for me, it's all about interacting well. And I've always just sort of had this way of looking at things and this urge to look at things so that we can increase interaction in the classroom and in classroom spaces, learning spaces.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love these framings of thinking about like how UDL might increase interaction as well as, you know, benefit everyone. And so I think Meg is going to elaborate a little bit on like what we actually mean when we talk about UDL.
Yeah, so UDL is a framework for planning and instruction. So it's not sort of a checklist of strategies you can use, although those checklists are helpful for ideas. It's more of a mindset and an approach to your teaching. So it's based on universal design and architecture. A very classic example is a curb cut, where some people need the curb cut to access the sidewalk and everyone else benefits from it, including people, strollers, luggage, roller skates, I guess no one roller scooters, etc. So it's a proactive approach rather than waiting for a student to come to and ask for an accommodation or to notice a student struggling. It's sort of anticipating, this is my learning goal. What are the possible barriers with these students? And then how can I offer options and flexibility so that they can fully engage? And then they have sort of different guidelines and categories for giving these options. And those are related to how are the students engaging with the class? How are you representing content to them? And how are they expressing to you what they're learning? So it's also this idea that moving from somebody needs to have a recognized disability with a label to this idea that we all have this spectrum of abilities. And whether or not a student has a label, they're on a spectrum of how they take in text information, how they write in English, all these sorts of requirements that we have in classes. So recognizing and expecting that spectrum as normal and then just planning for it. So basically widening access.
Yeah, thank you so much for that overview, Meg. And next, I think we'll kind of get into some fun stuff about like, okay, what does that mean? Like, what are the 101 practices that you would suggest for us to incorporate into our instruction? And I would love for all of y'all to weigh in, and you can kind of figure out who would like to go first.
I can share some things. You know, I've been thinking a lot about online learning, and particularly we know folks are coming to online learning with so many different things, different internet connections. So even things like being open to whether people turn their video on or off, depending on how good their internet speed is, who might be there in the background, how messy their house is, all of those things can make it more welcoming. Sharing slides ahead of time so that folks can use those to plan for the class, make notes. Sharing an agenda at the top of the day. This is what we're going to do, and here's the order. And also giving clear expectations. We've been reading a lot of Amelia Bedelia in my house lately. I don't know how many of you have read those books, but they ask her to do something and she doesn't ask a follow-up question, but they don't give her clear instructions. And every time she does the wrong thing, right? And you know, just how much could she have benefited from some more clear expectations? Those are some of the simple things off the top of my head. I'm sure you all can add to them.
My cursor keeps disappearing. It's a real problem. Finding that mute button. There are so many simple little things. And, you know, for me, one thing I end up talking with faculty a lot, faculty who are teaching face-to-face, and this works for Zoom when you're sharing information in multiple screens also. For a lot of folks, if you can listen to someone talking and you can watch some other piece of information happening, either graphic or text or a video or whatever, you can watch and listen at the same time. But that's an extra cognitive load for many, many, many students. Deaf students, in fact, cannot listen and watch at the same time. So one strategy is to not talk while you're also sharing something that you want students to watch or to read. Just be silent, take a break. Let them watch and read and then talk after they're done. It's super easy when they're in front of you. If you're in a face-to-face class, just see when their eyeballs come back to you when they start pointing at you again rather than at the screen. To some extent that works with Zoom too. It's a little bit harder because when you share a screen, the thing gets, anyway. But there's various ways you can have people raise their hand when they're done, or, you know, there's various little ways to manage that. But that's one tip I find that can make a lot of difference to a lot of folks. It's not particularly an accommodation per se. I don't think I've ever seen a letter from the Disability Services Office saying to not present things in 2 different channels at the same time, but it's something that is designed for a particular kind of students' challenges when they're accessing information from the visual channel, at the 2 sources of information from a visual channel at the same time, which they can't do, but it helps a whole bunch of people at the same time. So that's one example.
For me, an example is examining what do I assume participation should look like, and then imagining other ways that students might demonstrate engagement and participation. So just because we're in an online world now, giving examples from that, Brianna brought up having the camera on. So in a synchronous setting, having your camera on, looking at the camera, speaking, contributing verbally to conversation. These are sort of the typical what what we might assume is active participation. And then in asynchronous settings, lots of writing on the discussion board, writing in annotations, so, things like that. So what are alternate ways that I can offer to students to demonstrate their active engagement in the course that doesn't require them to do it in one way that they may not, some people just might not prefer, and others just really have a barrier to accessing.
I love that kind of prompts, like I think that's a great question I can ask myself is like, what am I assuming people are coming into this interaction with? And then kind of trying to figure out if that's probably wrong or at least not complete. I'm curious if just in follow-up, if any of y'all can describe what are the multiple options you give.
So, you know, just using Meg's example, instead of writing, can somebody record an audio comment or a video or draw a picture, you know, thinking about other ways that folks can, sorry, I've got my child sitting next to me, it's distracting me, but other ways that folks can give that, again, demonstrate that knowledge. Even things like using breakout rooms or small group discussions in addition to lecturing, right?
Yeah, so I do happen to teach in an education department. However, I recommend this for any department that there are a lot of free K-12 tools out there now that have some of this functionality built in for you. So for example, right now, during my students are doing readings and learning pods, and their pod is annotating together in an app called Cami. Cami allows them to type a comment, to just like Brianna said, voice, video, draw, upload an image, any of that. So they're having a conversation that's asynchronous, but it's also, they get to choose what that looks like and what that mode is. And I didn't have to do any work to set that up. I just chose Cami and it was all set up for me. And it's the same with reading. In graduate courses that I teach, it's very text heavy, like many courses are, and providing platforms that offer text to speech, that offer changing the font size, making adjustments based on personal preference, and then having dictionaries and translation built right in is very useful.
Thanks. Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, let me just toss out one more thing. So if you're using Zoom breakout rooms, one thing that can be handy is to have a companion Google Doc for the whole class at once. And then when the breakout rooms are done and they come back, have a little report out section in there. It's not that you need every single person to type in there. It's that someone can talk and say, could you please type whatever, you know, just you have a little section where the different groups can report out on what they were discussing. And then the whole class gets a bit of a notes from that whole session, even on the groups that they weren't in. So that's an example of where you can add something extra that helps everyone out. It doesn't require anyone to respond in a particular way, but then also leaves people with resources at the end.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. And I have to, we were going to do a Google Doc for this session and I did not set that up. I'm sorry. Thank you. Next time. Thank you. That's a great tip. It's kind of this like living document that can then kind of become an artifact. So moving on, I'm curious, what misconceptions have you found that like instructors or department heads or others have about UDL, and what strategies have you used to kind of help get people on board? And I'm happy for anyone to address this, hopefully all of you.
The thing that I get most often, most quickly is like, oh my gosh, I can't possibly design something for everybody and when I haven't even met the students before class starts. and that's not really the goal. The goal, the way I approach it is, you know, you try. Look, I'm likely to have some folks who could benefit from talking and from typing. Okay, we can build that in. But then I often think about, you know, when I see something happening in class is like, oh, is there something quick I can adjust for that? So I'm teaching right now and I'm using Google Docs fairly heavily. And one student had scheduled a one-on-one with me, and she said, you know, it would really help if we had some section breaks in between sections in the Google Doc, because it gets really overwhelming. That's totally easy. So I insert page breaks now, or they can. There's stuff like that that are just simple reactions to trouble spots that you're noticing that can really help. One thing at a time.
I think that that response of being overwhelmed is super common. And I think we do a lot of professional development for faculty, and they basically are like, I don't have time for that. I don't have time to do any of this. And so we ask folks to kind of take and look at both the things that they already are doing. Like, you're probably doing some things that already are good practices of universal design, right? Maybe you're recording your lectures so that folks can watch it asynchronously or rewatch it, right? So you can identify some strategies you're already using, you know, give yourself a pat on the back. And then identify the low-hanging fruit. So Sarah's example is perfect, right? Like, oh, I could introduce some scaffolding within this Google Doc I have, and that's going to help people for a variety of reasons, right? And then identify what are those longer-term things that are something you could do or want to do, but you're not going to do it right now. But maybe next year when you're redesigning the course, or, you know, in the future, and kind of keeping track of those and hopefully actually coming back to them, right? Instead of that just being that to-do list you never get to.
Yeah, to build off of that, this idea of don't wait till you have the time to figure out how to fully incorporate UDL into your entire course. Do one thing that you can do right now in this context. And maybe that's a really small thing the first time, that's okay. It's so much better to start with one small thing and widen access that way than to wait till that time that never comes when you're fully prepared. I think for me, it's this idea that it may, this fear that it could sort of make the class easier or threaten the academic integrity of the class. And I would say that it's not about that. And if that's what you're doing, then that's not UDL, right? It's about giving students the access to fully participate in all of that rich academic content and rigorous content. And it may look a little bit different than we're used to, but you wouldn't want to be taking any of the high level thinking or learning goals out of it.
Yeah, I'm curious if maybe I can ask a couple of questions that are a little bit off script. Just specifically, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about, first of all, maybe how grading looks differently. Like, I think we have a lot of rubrics for kind of text-based or programmatic-based assignments. If any of you have ideas on, like, if you do make submissions more flexible, how do you translate that rubric to assess something like a video or a drawing or something like that?
We're all rushing to answer that one, I see. I think, like grading anything, it just takes sitting down and figuring out what you're really after. You know, what are the outcomes that you're looking for? Is it really that you want them to write 12 sentences on some topic? Probably not. You probably don't care so much whether they write it or if they say it, or if, you know, you're looking for, like, have they summarized one or two meaty ideas relevant to the question? The thing I have moved more to lately is it's called a specifications grading, where I'm looking for folks to get to a certain competency. I'm not looking to evaluate whether they're an 83% or an 89% or a 92%. I don't care. They don't usually care. So I have switched recently, and everything, I give them bins of things to shoot for. If they want a B, they have to complete this stuff, and they have to complete every piece of it at a satisfactory level. And if they want an A, they have to do that plus an extra set. And then everything is either satisfactory or not. And I give them a very clear guidelines on what satisfactory means, and that's the key. So makes my job very easy. I go through and I see, is that satisfactory? Yes. If not, they have to redo it. And they redo it, and it's just very simple. So it takes sort of a lot of the pain away about grading.
How has that changed the sorts of grades that kids are getting in your class, that students are getting in your class?
Not a lot. Not a lot. Not everybody goes for an A. I'm in a program where they have to get a B in all their courses in the program. So it makes it very easy. It's A or B. So I don't have to worry about C's, but it's also very clear. It would be easy to add another level below that. And it's very clear whether or not they reach the target.
Thanks for asking that question, Brianna, because I think that really materializes this, like, that it is a myth that by making your course accessible and by making expectations clear, that it doesn't mean everyone's just going to pass. They still have to do the work. So thank you for that. The other kind of follow-up question, a little bit in this area of misconception, but not totally, is how do you recommend folks strategize toward those larger changes that may require maybe department buy-in for things like supporting captioning or supporting other kind of tools and resources, or a switching grading policy or something like that? Do you have any recommendations for how to move toward those larger scale structural changes?
I mean, I feel like offering tangible, demonstrated examples. Here's what this looks like in this course in our department. Here's what it could look like for every course in our department. And looking at really doable, incremental changes. So like you gave the example of captioning. So working towards one goal that's very focused, as opposed to let's do everything. And then any tools that you create and you can share departmentally and other faculty are able to use and benefit from also creates motivation.
Yeah, I really like that example of thinking about like chunking it out. And so I think for something like captioning, I think of like, okay, maybe it's a step is that, all the videos that we show will have captions, right? And then another step would be moving toward kind of the live content captioning. So I'm curious next, Sara, if you can just share with us a little bit about why, it sounds maybe contradictory, but why, even if we are practicing universal design for learning, we still need to be supporting students who do need accommodations?
Sure. I think, accommodations are required by law, first of all. We all must comply with that, and students are entitled to it. And it really sets a baseline for what students need to succeed in the classroom. In my experience, it's not enough and it's not comprehensive. And the things that we're talking about with universal design aren't necessarily going to be addressed by the disability accommodations that are listed in a letter. Often the accommodations are things like somebody needing extra time for tests or quiet room to take tests or access to an interpreter or materials in an alternate format, like an electronic format. Those are pretty basic access needs. If we go beyond that, we're really starting to talk about inclusion and full inclusion and engagement and interaction in the classrooms. You can't have inclusion without access, first of all. But second of all, it's a good first start, but it certainly doesn't give you everything. So we can't ignore it. In many cases, I think it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to go much further than that. So that's my view on accommodations versus UDL.
And I'm curious if, sorry, did I cut you off?
I was just going to see if Brianna or Meg had any other additions to that, but go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's totally right on, right? Like something like you mentioned somebody with a mobility impairment, you might need an adjustable height table. Well, the college might not have one in every classroom, but an accommodation to make sure that exists in the classroom that student needs it in, that's, clearly an accommodation. And even captioning, automatic captions suffice for the sake of universal design, but they wouldn't necessarily suffice for sufficient access for a student who was deaf or hard of hearing, because we all know the quality of automatic captions varies. So just a couple examples.
Yeah, Meg, did you have anything to add?
Sure, just on the flip side of that, just like Sara said earlier, even with universal design, you can't design for every single possible accommodation, and that's not the goal of UDL. So really they're complementary to each other. UDL working hand in hand with accommodations.
And I'm curious if any of you can speak to your experience as an instructor. Is there anything anticipatory that you can do, like before the class begins, to kind of anticipate accommodations or help students understand that, you know, those are welcome in your class, even though it's legal? Like, are there things that you do to help students make sure they know that that's something you welcome?
You know, I think a simple thing to do is, oftentimes you have that statement in your syllabus, right, about Disability Services Office, but highlighting that and encouraging students to have a conversation with you about their access needs. You know, even if a student hands you the letter that they've gotten, or, you know, you get the letter through the system of what they're entitled to, that letter doesn't necessarily tell you everything that's useful to know about that student. And so encouraging that open dialogue is important. And as Sara pointed out, when you have those conversations, sometimes you learn something about a simple fix that you can make that makes everything better for folks.
Yeah, Brianna, I love the statement idea. I put that in my syllabi, so it's also personalized. It's coming from me in addition to the required one. The other thing that I do is I usually send out, especially right now I'm teaching completely asynchronous classes. So connecting with students is difficult that way. So I send out a survey the first week of class, and one of the questions is, do you need any accommodations for any reason? You know, if they come back with something completely unreasonable, I say, let me help you access, you know, the disability office, or let's come up with something else. But usually they're completely reasonable. Sometimes students disclose a disability and they're not registered with the accessibility office. Other times, you know, they're asking for another reason. I have to do all my work in a shared room, so I can't speak out loud. I have, you know, twin 6-month-olds at home. You know, and normally students really ask for things that are really very reasonable and things I've usually already built in.
Thanks so much for that. And Meg, I think you started to get at kind of the next big question, but I'm curious how UDL has changed, or what is particularly important now with much of our learning being hybrid or remote or asynchronous. If you can point out any specific changes or specific UDL practices that are just even more important.
You know, one thing we've talked a lot about is setting clear expectations for how you want folks to interact, right? So if you are having synchronous meetings, do you want people using the chat? Do you want people asking questions verbally or in the chat? You know, and letting folks know what you want, when questions can be, but then also allowing folks to ask those questions in different ways, right? So I was talking to a student this week who has a neurological issue that affects her fine motor control. And, you know, she was looking at a conference, and the conference, all of the questions had to be answered via text entry. And she was like, I can't do that. I also can't use voice input, you know, my speech to text tool while I'm listening to something, you know, without getting interference. So I don't know how I'm going to interact, right? So just letting folks ask questions in multiple ways, telling them whether you want them to use the raise hand function or, you know, whatever settings your tool has, and letting folks know that that is, you know, huge.
I think some things are easier now. Like many textbooks now have an electronic version. So that's gotten a lot easier. And I just automatically now include in my syllabus multiple ways to access the book. If there's a library copy, if there's an electronic copy, if there's a, a way to purchase it other than through the bookstore. So I just post that really early and make some options really clear from the get-go in some ways. So that part's gotten easier. I think the things that are harder are what people are mentioning, flexibility for interacting and different conditions that people have going on at home that you may or may not know about.
The two concerns I hear from students just across the board are with online courses are not understanding directions or having miscommunications, and then feeling less engaged because they're not connected with the professor or other learners. So kind of some quick fixes to that are, when you're giving instructions, what is a second way you can give the instructions? Maybe it's a checklist plus you go over it verbally. When you're presenting information, can you do it in at least 2 modalities, right? Can you have a video and a text, right? That's the easiest, but there's also other ways. There's interactive ways as well. So just that baseline, are you communicating in multiple ways? And then really being intentional about providing opportunities for students to collaborate and engage with each other, because they may not take the initiative themselves or really know how.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm curious if y'all just have any, before we move to the Q&A, if y'all just have any other things that you wanted to add that maybe came up for you during this panel and you didn't get a chance to share.
Meg brought up this idea of not everybody's necessarily registered with the Disability Services Office. And I think that's a really important thing to think about, particularly for students with invisible disabilities, getting the documentation they may need to let it be clear what their diagnosis and barriers are, and getting an accommodation can be extremely expensive. So, it's one way to think about too, like a lot of students with disabilities are not necessarily served, and those are students that are going to be underserved for a variety of other reasons. So making some of these adjustments and strategies and asking for feedback from students can help those students who might otherwise really be at a disadvantage.
For me, I would say, when you teach, especially large numbers of students over time, it's really easy to get jaded and see student communication as, oh, they're just trying to skate by, they're trying to make excuses. But this idea that Zaretta Hammond talks about in her book on culturally responsive teaching, which is about how do you widen your aperture for explanations of student behavior? What are, just like stepping back and pausing and thinking, what might other alternate explanations be? And it doesn't mean that you let students get away with anything or dismiss that behavior, but it just means you're open that there may be other legitimate reasons as you address the issue with the student. And I think, especially for me now, kind of coming from the perspective of a former grad student with disabilities, that meant the world to me when a professor had that wider lens and didn't just assume something about my intents or motives when I was struggling. So I think that's one of the biggest things that you can offer to a student.
What an excellent way to phrase it, Meg. Thanks. I think, related to both what Meg and Brianna are saying, I am constantly tossing out there to students, hey, let me know if there's anything you need to learn this better. It's a conversation. It's inviting a conversation. I think a lot of, when I talk about this to folks, sometimes to other faculty, sometimes they think, wow, aren't you opening yourself up to a lot of really wacky, strange requests? And I can say, most of the requests are really minor. They're like, can you add page breaks? You know, it's not such a big deal. And the requests that are off base are usually wildly off base. I have one example of a student who asked for an accommodation due to disability that he didn't want to work with one particular person in his classroom, and that's not an accommodation for a disability. Nor does that match with the collaborative nature of the small group assignments in the first place. So, you know, for me, it's always been really clear when it's a reasonable request and when it's not a reasonable request. So if that helps dispel any of the myths about, you know, how much students are going to get by with, or if, you know, they're going to whatever, they're going to steal the whole thing if you give them an inch. By and large, they make relatively small requests. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, I would love to have take some questions, and this has been super, and thank you all so much. I've learned a lot, and Meg, I really appreciate kind of that concluding framing of just like widening our aperture for like what could be the reason. And so if you'd like to ask a question, and if you could use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and Amy Pavel, one of our other postdocs, will kind of call out your name for you to ask the question.
While we're waiting for people to raise their hand, I don't yet. Oh, there's someone. Go ahead, June.
Okay, hope I'm coming through. Thank you all again for the wonderful tips and tricks. I think they're personally for me very useful to think about. So my question, I think I should explain my background a little bit. I'm an undergraduate student, but I also, depending on the semester, TA a relatively large intro programming course. And one of the sort of pitfalls with this kind of the course size is that there's a very set method of instruction. The assignments are written and they're done in a certain way. And this is something that I've had a lot of struggles with sort of changing, because it's such a fixed system. It's been there for like 8-9 years. And the specific thing is like students are asked to do written assignments on PDFs. Number one, that's really hard because editing a PDF, like scrubbing on top of it, you either have to have specialized hardware, or you have a Mac where you might have preview, but even that's not that accessible, so on and so forth. And just like beginning that conversation of saying, hey, let's try to figure out some other way to make this work, like port over the assignment to a different method, like that was really difficult. And so from your perspective, when you guys were addressing faculty members and their resistance to their change, what was that conversation like? Yeah.
You know, I'll just say, I think particularly as a TA, it can be really hard to address some of these issues because you're not making a lot of these decisions and a lot of these choices, right? Beyond that, a lot of TAs I know have struggled because they don't necessarily get access to information about accommodations when they're working with students to know that this student needs X, Y, or Z, right? Because a lot of times that goes to the faculty member. So I think that's a really hard place to sit from. But, you know, sharing feedback with faculty and making suggestions, particularly constructive suggestions of those low-hanging fruit that could help make a difference, may be a place to start. But it's definitely a difficult place to sit, and I empathize with that.
Yeah, if you're interested in making these sorts of changes as a TA, I really recommend focusing on relationship building with the faculty that you work with, and then coming from that perspective. And specifically for computer science education, there are kind of two angles that I've seen be effective. So one is, we know that departments are losing marginalized students. They're losing women, they're losing LGBTQ students, they're losing students of color. And so changing your pedagogy can actually help retain those students. And so we've seen, like at Harvey Mudd, where they have gender parity now after they made major changes to their CS 101 course. now they've written papers on that process of what it was like. So, you know, citing research, citing examples from other universities, and having this goal of retaining our students can be a useful argument.
I think the only thing I can add here is that sometimes just having conversations, not between a student trying to get a higher grade and the professor, but between a student as a consumer or a TA who works with students who are trying to work through with these materials, just having conversations about, hey, how could this go easier? And sometimes if you have ideas on what could actually make it easier, if you present those ideas in a problem solving mode rather than a, you know, you professor are making it really hard, you know, I think it's, you know, it's a relationship. It's trying to find common ground and figure out common needs. And, you know, everybody, for the most part, is focused on the same thing. You know, they want students to learn and they want to teach well. So that's kind of the goal.
So I had a quick question. So if you would like to ask a question, by the way, you can use the raise hand feature. This has been really awesome to hear so far. I like taught my first course like semi recently, and I mean, just from this, I'm like, oh, there's so many things I want to do differently. But one question I have is group work and how to ensure that not only when students are in your class on your time and you can structure the time, but also where they go off to their own groups, if there's things you might consider, and that's both in the individual, in the work itself, and also in the like group formation that you could consider to make it more, you know, UDL like.
I know one thing that we talk about is figuring out how you can structure that group work. You know, can you give folks an indication of here are these different roles, here are different ways that people can engage, and encouraging students to advocate for themselves once they're in a group, right? So encouraging a student to say, hey, you know what, this doesn't work for me because of X, Y, or Z. I really need to take on this role. Like, and encouraging those conversations can go a long way.
And adding to that, also asking for feedback from group members about the group dynamics early and often can be really good. What you don't want to have happen is get to the end and have somebody say, well, I did all the work and that person didn't do any. I mean, that's just a recipe for disaster. So build in group dynamic problem solving early on.
Yes, thank you. That's really helpful. I feel like planning in the processes ahead of time is probably a great thing for a lot of these things. So the next question is from Sunny.
Greetings, process. It was a wonderful session. So I previously worked on ethical approaches to empower disabled graduate students in STEM. And I basically looked at how SDS functions and the responsibilities of disabled students to get the accommodations or to get registered. And post-COVID, so what are the responsibilities of the instructors, or how is the communication between the three nodal points of the universal design for learning, I guess, instructors and disability services and students. So these three units need to function properly, I guess. So since everything has shifted virtually, they can't go in to get their documentation, and they can't go in to get their registered. So how is this functioning, and how much of burden is it for students now? Thank you.
I follow a fair number of listservs where there are disability services professionals, and just like all the rest of us, they're shifting online. So doing virtual intakes. So you can still get registered, send in electronic versions of documentation and that kind of stuff. So a lot of that hasn't changed. I think the accommodations that particular students need may change as things shift online for a variety of reasons. Even one of my colleagues who has some a hearing loss, she has to advocate every meeting. Can you all please put on your headsets because I hear more clearly if you have your headset on, right? And so that's something that we wouldn't have had, you know, in an in-person meeting. But so having those conversations and making sure that students' documentation reflects that, or that they can tell you like what's different for them in an online setting than not.
And I think just keeping in mind, and this is not about any individual institution, but across the board in higher education, you know, there are real barriers, including real barriers to accessing the Office of Accessibility, that can make it very difficult, even if students have a very clear-cut disability and need specific accommodations. So just keeping that in mind, being an advocate when you can, when it's requested, and just supporting students through the process.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the one challenge is that often faculty get this letter and that's it. You know, they give the extended time, they allow for an interpreter in the classroom, they make sure that there's, you know, they talk with the disability office and make sure that the disability office can get a electronic version of the book, you know, stuff like that. I think the three pieces need to really continue working together and continue collaborating, and it often is not that hard to make stuff happen that students need and students really can function much better with. So anything to keep that communication going is helpful.
I think another aspect to that relationship too is something I've heard a lot from graduate students, is that the accommodations that they might have gotten as an undergraduate are kind of meaningless as a graduate student, right? You don't need extended time on tests, right? General exams are structured in a way that may or may not work depending on a student's disability. There's a lot more about navigating your relationship with your advisor. I've spoken with blind graduate students that have a hard time getting accessible versions of journal articles or participating in, you know, the kind of the scholarly process. And so I think that's somewhere too where faculty members need to be understanding that disability services, particularly depending on your institution, may or may not be able to offer graduate students what they really need to be successful. And so being willing to work with students, listen to them, and be creative about how to make that work is important.
I'll just add, just to put this out there, to float this idea for those of you in a position to do this. I'm also working on a special ed computer science program at NYU, and we are actively recruiting grad students with disabilities and developing a relationship with the Office of Accessibility so that when we recruit these students, we're not just recruiting them into something that doesn't have support, but working together with that office. And you know, it takes time. So I expect that we will be building this relationship over the next year before we start enacting any of it. But consider recruiting students with disabilities into your programs.
I see, oh, never mind. Sunny still had his hand
me.
raised. Oh yeah, okay,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have one more question. I'm curious. So I have been to around like 50 student disability services websites in United States, like top 50 schools. But I couldn't find much of resources for international graduate students with disabilities to begin with, or to get started, and to get accommodations as well. So like, what is the state of, you know, getting disability, you know, services support, or, you know, for learning right now?
You know, I think that's an interesting question, and different disability services offices have different philosophies towards documentation. Kind of an old school approach was to really require specific documentation that had a diagnosis, so they knew exactly what the issues were and what accessibility issues needed to be addressed. And some newer approaches are a little bit less reliant on that specific documentation. And particularly for an international student, depending on, you know, what kind of documentation you can bring, whether it's in English and what that kind of be, I could imagine that that could be a struggle. I know I know several of our international students that we work with through Access to Computing were particularly worried this summer too about being all the visa issues. You know, one student in particular who was like, had a spinal cord injury since he's been in the US. And he was like, if I get sent home, it's not accessible back home, right? And so there definitely are specific issues there, but I'm kind of babbling at this point, so I'll stop talking.
I think we have time if there's a really quick question, but we are about at time. So thank you so much for taking the time, and just I'm so excited that this video will kind of live on, and so we will be able to kind of pass it around once we post it in a few days. So thank you so much. This was a huge hit. Really glad to have you all here. Yeah, just have any final words? Otherwise, I think we are done for today. Cool. Thanks so much, Brianna, Meg, and Sara. We will post the link to the video kind of on social media in a few days. If you have any other questions, let us know. I am curious if someone can do me a favor. We have an email list where we post announcements for the talk. So if someone out there, not me, so it'll take me a while, could post the link to join the email list in the chat. Love to have y'all on that list if you're interested in learning about our upcoming talks.
Thanks for the invitation, Cindy. This is great.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. It's been totally a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks.